All right, so get ready, everybody, because today we are taking a deep dive into a topic that has the whole baseball world buzzing: deferred contracts.
Yeah, it seems like every time you turn around, there's another headline about a massive contract with a huge chunk of money being pushed into the future.
We've got a whole stack of research here, articles, financial analyses.
Yeah,
It's a lot to unpack.
it is. And it's not just about the numbers themselves, right? These contracts have huge ripple effects throughout the league.
Absolutely. They impact team strategy, competitive balance, the whole landscape of the sport.
We're going to try to break it all down for you folks.
Mhm.
How teams are using these deferrals, the potential advantages, disadvantages, even whether the MLB should step in and set some boundaries.
But before we get too deep into the weeds, maybe we should start with the basics. For anyone who's not totally familiar with this, what exactly is a deferred contract?
Yeah, good point. In the simplest terms, it means a player agrees to take a portion of their salary later on.
Sometimes way later on, right?
Right, sometimes even after they've retired. You can almost think of it like a giant interest-free loan from the player to the team.
That's a good analogy. And it's not just about kicking the can down the road, is it? There's a reason teams are so keen on doing this.
You got it. The luxury tax is a big factor here.
Right, because teams have to pay a penalty if their total payroll goes over a certain limit.
So deferrals become this strategic tool to manage those costs and stay under the radar.
It's like a financial puzzle, trying to fit all these mega salaries under the cap.
Exactly, and some teams are getting pretty creative with their puzzle pieces.
We'll get to that. But first, maybe we should lay down a clear definition of what we're actually talking about here.
Yeah, let's get official. Our sources point us to good old Merriam-Webster for this one.
So what does Merriam-Webster have to say about deferred?
They say it means withheld or delayed for or until a stated time.
Okay, pretty straightforward. Sounds simple enough, right?
It does, but then you start bringing in the astronomical sums of money we're talking about and the long-term implications. It gets pretty complicated.
Imagine this. A player signs a $100 million contract over 5 years. Seems like a pretty standard mega deal, right?
Right. But instead of getting a nice even $20 million each year, they might agree to take, say, $10 million a year for those 5 years.
Okay, so far so good. But then,
And then another $10 million each year for the next 10 years.
whoa, so even after they've retired, that's wild.
It is. It's like getting paid to not play.
And you know what blows my mind? This isn't some newfangled scheme.
Oh, yeah. Deferred contracts have been around for a while.
I mean, remember Bobby Bonilla?
The legend.
Back in '91, he signed with the Mets, and guess what? The guy still gets a cool $1 million every July 1st.
Talk about a sweet retirement plan.
And it's going to keep going until 2035.
Amazing, right. But, Bonilla's deal, while iconic, wasn't really the start of a trend.
So teams weren't really jumping on the deferred bandwagon back then.
It's interesting because it wasn't until much later that teams really started seeing the strategic potential of these deferrals. They started thinking beyond just managing existing contracts.
They started seeing it as a way to build super teams.
Exactly.
So what was the turning point? When did these mega deferrals really start to take off?
Well, our research points to Max Scherzer's 2015 contract with the Nationals as a real turning point.
That was a huge deal, right?
Oh, yeah, $210 million. Huge at the time. But get this, $105 million of that was deferred.
Wow. So more than half?
Yeah, a massive jump in scale. It really signaled that teams were starting to get serious about deferrals as a way to gain a competitive edge.
And of course, the Nationals did go on to win the World Series in 2019.
So maybe there's something to this strategy.
Maybe so. But hold on, folks, because things are about to get even more astronomical. We're talking Shohei Ohtani and the Dodgers.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting.
Ohtani, a once-in-a-generation talent. Pitcher and a hitter.
The whole package. And the Dodgers just signed him to a record-breaking $700 million deal.
10 years, averaging $70 million a year.
Except, here's the kicker. $680 million of that is deferred.
Whoa. Let me repeat that. $680 million deferred. So how does that even work?
Okay, so until 2033, he gets a relatively modest $2 million a year.
Okay, modest for Shohei Ohtani, maybe.
Huh, right. But then, get ready.
Yeah.
He'll get a whopping $68 million a year for the next decade.
Wow. That's some serious long-term financial planning.
It is, and it's raising some big questions about what this means for the rest of the league.
I mean, the Dodgers are basically pushing the boundaries of what's possible with these deferrals.
It makes you wonder, are they creating a system where only a handful of wealthy teams can afford to build these super teams?
The Dodgers currently have 4 MVP winners on their roster and over $1 billion in deferred contracts.
It's a lot.
Is this basically buying championships?
And what does that mean for teams in smaller markets who are trying to compete?
That's the big question, isn't it? Is this creating an uneven playing field? And what are the consequences? Not just for the teams, but for the players themselves. It's complicated. We've got a lot more to unpack, so stay with us. We'll be right back to explore all of that and more. We were just talking about the Dodgers and their, let's say, enthusiastic approach to these deferred contracts.
Yeah, they're really pushing the limits.
It's a strategy that's got everyone talking. But are other big market teams following suit? What about the Yankees, the Mets? Are they jumping on this mega deferral bandwagon?
That's a great question, and it's something we really dug into in our research. Interestingly, it seems like teams like the Mets and the Yankees have been a bit more cautious.
Oh, really? So they're not completely shying away from deferrals?
No, not completely. They're still using them strategically, but not on the same massive scale as the Dodgers.
So give me an example. How are they using them differently?
Well, take the Mets, for example. They recently signed Sean Manaea to a 3-year, $75 million contract.
Okay, so another big contract. But is there a deferral hidden in there?
You bet. About $22 million of Manea's contract is deferred.
Okay, so it's a significant chunk, but...
And it's nowhere near the hundreds of millions we're seeing in some of these other deals.
Right, right. So it seems like there's a real spectrum of approaches here.
Yeah.
Some teams are diving headfirst into the deep end of the deferral pool, while others are dipping their toes in more cautiously.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag.
But the big question that keeps coming up is, should MLB do something to regulate these contracts? I mean, should there be limits on how much money can be pushed into the future?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And, our sources actually offer some pretty interesting perspectives on this.
So what are they saying?
Well, some experts argue that a cap on deferrals is absolutely necessary to ensure a level playing field.
So they're saying it's about competitive balance.
Exactly. One source even suggests a 15% limit on all new contracts.
Whoa, a 15% limit. So, for example, if a player signs for $100 million, only $15 million of that could be deferred.
Exactly.
That's a pretty bold proposal. I can see how that would shake things up. So what are the arguments in favor of that kind of cap?
Well, the main argument is that it would prevent teams from basically circumventing the luxury tax, right? It would stop them from buying championships by loading up on star players through creative accounting.
Makes sense. It would force teams to make tougher choices.
Right. Tougher choices about which players to sign, how to structure their payrolls.
So it levels the playing field in a way.
That's the idea.
But what about the counter arguments? Are there downsides to limiting deferrals?
Of course, there are always two sides to every coin.
So what are the potential downsides?
Well, the most obvious one is that it could potentially reduce player earnings. I mean, if a big chunk of their salary is deferred, there's always a risk that they might not get paid if something goes wrong down the line.
Right. Like what if the team faces financial difficulties or the league goes through some major restructuring?
Exactly. You never know what the future holds.
And let's not forget, players have a limited career span.
They want to maximize their earnings while they can.
So limiting deferrals could take away a valuable tool for them.
Right. For both teams, A&D players, actually. It's about financial flexibility.
So smaller market teams might rely on deferrals to stay competitive.
They could. And some players might prefer to spread out their income over a longer period, even after they retire.
For financial security.
Exactly.
So it's a balancing act, isn't it? Trying to weigh the benefits of financial flexibility against the concerns about competitive imbalance and player risk. Where do we go from here?
Tough question. There are valid points on both sides. But one thing's for sure. This conversation needs to continue. We need to have an open and honest dialogue about the role of these contracts in baseball's future.
About fairness and financial stability for everyone involved.
Exactly.
It's not just about the money. It's about the integrity of the game.
Couldn't agree more.
We want a league where every team has a fair shot, where players are treated fairly, and where the sport thrives for generations to come.
That's the goal.
But there's another layer to this that we haven't even touched on yet.
Oh, and what's that?
The long-term implications. What happens when these deferred payments come due years, even decades down the line?
Oh, that's a great point. Are teams setting themselves up for trouble down the road?
And are players taking on a huge risk by trusting teams to honor these agreements so far into the future? We'll be back after a quick break to explore all of that. We've been digging deep into this whole world of deferred contracts.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like those long home runs that just keep sailing.
Keep going and going.
You think you've got a grasp on it, but the implications just keep unfolding.
Absolutely.
We were just talking about the potential risks
Right.
for both teams and players,
Yeah.
especially when you think about these payments stretching years or even decades into the future.
It really is like a high-stakes gamble.
Yeah, when you put it that way.
Teams are basically betting on their own future.
You mean their financial stability?
Yeah, hoping they'll be able to handle these payments down the line.
But what if things change? I mean, the financial landscape is always shifting.
Exactly. What if a team hits a rough patch or the whole league goes through a major economic upheaval?
It makes you wonder if they're setting themselves up for a financial curveball they can't hit.
It's a valid concern.
And then there's the players,
Right. The players are putting a lot of faith in these organizations.
trusting them to honor these agreements long after they've retired.
It really raises questions about trust and accountability.
What happens if a team changes ownership or the league implements new financial regulations?
Yeah. Could those deferred payments become a burden?
A liability, even.
It's possible.
It's like a game of financial chess.
I like that.
The moves are being made today, but we might not see the consequences for years.
It's a long game.
It makes you think, are we setting a sustainable precedent here?
That's the question the MLB needs to grapple with.
It's not just about the here and now
Right. It's about the long-term health of the league.
and the financial well-being of the players.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
And we've really only scratched the surface here.
But one thing is clear, this conversation is far from over.
It's just getting started.
As these mega deals become more common and the sums of money involved keep climbing the stakes, just keep getting higher.
Higher for everyone involved.
Teams, players, the league, even the fans.
It's a situation that requires careful consideration from all sides.
We need to think about what kind of future we want for baseball.
And whether these complex financial arrangements are really serving the best interests of the game.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this question. If you were sitting in the commissioner's chair, what would you do about deferred contracts?
Would you let this trend continue unchecked? Would you impose limits? Or would you try to create more transparency and accountability?
It's a decision that will have a ripple effect throughout the league.
Shaping the financial landscape of baseball for years to come.
And ultimately, it's a decision that will determine what kind of legacy this era of baseball will leave behind.
Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive.